Hello and welcome back, or welcome to Version of Events. I'm Jessica, and today we're joined by Jayson Blair, host of the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. Ellie isn't with us this week. It's the summer holidays, so she's very busy, and she's also currently knee-deep in cardboard boxes moving house. So I'm flying solo for this one, but I think and hope it's a conversation worth sticking around for. Now, you might have heard of Jayson in another context, and we do address that during the interview. But this isn't a rehash of a scandal from over 20 years ago. Yes, Jayson made mistakes, but he chose to get better, not bitter. And while the world might know him as a headline, to us, he's a friend. He's a fierce advocate for victims of crime, especially those who are silenced, sidelined, or forgotten. He shines a light on the crisis of missing and murdered indigenous people, particularly women and girls, and stands with the families still demanding answers. Today we talk about Jayson's background and how that brought him to where he is today. We also discuss the cases of missing people like Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, a missing indigenous woman from Montana, and what we can do better as a true crime community to highlight these cases. So let's get into it. So hi, Jayson. Thanks for coming on the show today. How are you doing?
I am good, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on. I always love being on other good podcasts, both because it's great to talk about the work we're both doing, but it also gives me, I think, an opportunity. I get new ideas from people when I have conversations like this. So I always appreciate the chance to talk. So.
Awesome as well. Yeah, we appreciate you coming on. So I suppose first question I'd like to ask is that some of our listeners, and we've covered this sort of in the intro, our listeners might think that they know who you are, but who is Jayson Blair today? What are you all about?
Well, I would venture to guess some significant of your portion of your listeners probably weren't born when right, and then a chunk of them are probably familiar with my story. But I actually, most of my background and most of my career, I was a journalist. When I was a little kid, I really loved writing, but I think it was really driven just by my curiosity about the world. And writing was, an opportunity to share what I found, which kind of makes sense. I'm the son of an educator, so I like that idea of sharing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, what I found. And so I think, by the time I was in high school, I was working for my student newspaper. I was seeing the powerful impact of journalism. And I just started interning with all sorts of daily, and I think it was probably like 8, 9 internships between the end of high school and getting out of college. And so eventually I ended up getting into a New York Times program to be an intern there, and then got hired as a reporter once I left school. So I was, I think at the time, the youngest reporter in the newsroom, and I was the youngest reporter in decades because, most people come to a place like the New York Times mid-career or other things like that. And I just really loved it, was enthralled with it. And
About how old were you then?
okay, so I was probably 22 when I got free. So yeah, so really, really, really young. I had worked at the Washington Post. I had worked at the Boston Globe. I had worked at a bunch of different locations. Yeah, so I think I got the craft of journalism, right? Like the craft of interviewing people, the craft of collecting information. What I think I didn't have was really this sort of both general maturity, which makes sense, right? And the emotional maturity. And then, I've told this story in so many different ways because I think every day, every year, I learn something new about myself and I learn something new about it. But I think what really happened for me was I think a great way to look at it is journalism has a really awesome ability to impact people in a positive way. And you get that awesome feedback loop, right? You write stories about some marginalized person being harmed, and then, government may make a change or a community may make a change, and you can see your impact. And then in my head, I think I got this idea that the way to have the most impact would be to have the best beat or assignment. And I ended up on this like hamster wheel, right? Of trying to move up and trying to move up and sort of losing sight of some of those like altruistic values that got me into it, because I do really believe journalism has power to heal people, has the power to help people, and it also has the power to entertain people. And I don't think you can. It's easy to dismiss the entertaining part, and I think true crime is very much like this. But entertainment is a transporting experience. When you are listening to something that's very interesting, it takes you out of your worries of the day and provides, as crazy as it sounds, a measure of peace. And I think it's very healthy for people. But long story short, I had a drug and alcohol addiction, went off to rehab, was getting back on my feet, disregarded advice that I should go see a psychiatrist and get help. And symptoms of bipolar disorder started to appear and emerge. And they were at a really crazy time because 9/11 had just happened. We were getting ready to be on war footing for what eventually became the Iraq war. The sniper shootings in DC were happening. And, in short, I basically lost my ability, I think, to function and do my job, but I was very fearful that I wouldn't get a second chance after having to go off to rehab. So I didn't reach out to the resources that existed around me. The New York Times newsroom may be a tough place. They may drive you to insanity, but good Lord, will they help you when you need help?
Yeah.
And I just didn't tap into those resources. And ultimately, I think out of an effort to be able to do my job, but not tell people I wasn't doing well, I ended up plagiarizing and fabricating information. And I think the big lesson for me was that as somebody who really cared about the profession and cares about the profession deeply and got into it for very good reasons, man, look out for those slippery slopes that you can fall down that will lead you off course. What was my slippery slope? It was pride. It was this idea that I was unwilling to ask for help and I'm going to do it on my own. But the beauty of all this, right? I have still had an awesome opportunity to have a positive impact on journalism by talking to journalism students, by talking at conferences and other events about my experience. And what I've found today, as journalism has sort of been defunded, at the same time they're expected to do more, the mental health of journalists is even a greater concern. And so I feel blessed to have the opportunity to be able to address that and be a resource for people. And I wish there was another way I could have become the person that I am today. But if you told me I'll wipe away that whole time scandal that you committed, but you'll have to go back to being the person you were, I would go through it again. So
That's a really amazing answer. Thank you.
you're welcome.
It's interesting you mentioned about mental health and kind of not seeking help. And do you think that's kind of influenced what you do today? Because I know you're a therapist. Am I getting your title right? Or
I work as what they call a mental health coach. So what we would do, or my typical role in that part of my many different jobs, is I'll supplement care. So you may go to a therapist and you may focus on your past, how you got to where you are right now. You may go to a psychiatrist and that will give you an opportunity to get medication for help. But my work is very focused on the part, instead of your past, your present and your future and helping you get there. So I work, I have sessions very similar to a therapist where I talk to my clients, but I'm a part of their lives on a day-to-day basis. They can call me at any time. They can email me. So we're actually working on the practical applications. Now, one of the great things for psychiatry and therapy, when you have a coach involved, we're often seeing warning signs or problems or people slipping in their compliance or some method not working earlier. So we're able to help address it with the team. So yes, it absolutely influenced what I did. And the person who convinced me to do it, it was very much because of my background in history. They thought I would bring an interesting perspective. And, I was very nervous when I got into it
Yeah.
because I was like, if these people know my background, why would they possibly trust me? And what I found was that the opposite was true, that people actually came to me because my background. Was one of a client about it once, and she said to me, "Oh, it was easy." She said, "I knew you wouldn't judge me." And I think there's truth to that. I tend to be a fairly unjudgmental person, and I don't think I was born with that quality. I think that experience of being humbled really created that quality. I mean, we're in similar social circles among podcasters, and Jess, I'll be the last person to drop someone. I will be the last person to judge someone, and I just think that comes from experience. And I was talking to somebody, another podcaster, about that who is frustrated with the coverage and the behavior of another podcaster. And I said to them, this person was saying to me, I don't understand how you won't let this person go. And I said, well, when you've done what I've done, and you've recovered like I have, it's really hard to give up on somebody.
So on your podcast, the Silver Linings Handbook, you talk to a lot of kind of victims, families, and victims of true crime, of crime, and I suppose victims of true crime as well, and kind of how they,
It's a very
what
good
their stories are. So yeah, would you say
There
past the,
victims of true crime.
yeah? So do you? I mean, obviously, who what we've been through influences everything, but I suppose does that kind of lead to the way you approach victims, because you do so in a very kind of compassionate and victim centric way.
Yeah, and I don't think I intend to be victim centric per se, but what I would say is a lot of times in true crime and journalism where we are not compassionate toward victims, it has very little to do with story. It's unnecessary. And what I find is a lot of lack of compassion. Let me give you a simple example. Let's say calling a victim family member in advance before you are going to tell the some reality about the victim's story, which may involve something that's ugly. Well, we don't not call them because they can somehow stop us. Like, they're not going to hijack my mic. They're not going to take over my office. They're not going to do anything like that. We call them because of our own anxiety. We don't call them because of our own anxiety or our own fear that they're going to knock us off the course that we want. Well, there's no reason to do that. You can tell the truth about someone, which is what I think we're all here for. Like, my first guiding principle is really truth. And you can tell the truth about people in a compassionate way. And I can think of a couple times where, I've had guests on. I rarely cut my interviews. Um, I might take out some mistaken things people said, but there have been a couple times where people have said things about people that I don't think are necessary to tell the story and are
Mm.
negative. Um, but if they are necessary to tell the story or they'll help with the case, I'll include it as long as it's the truth. And I think for me, Maura Murray's sister, Julie, really brought this home to me when she said to me, and, I had made the mistake in my head thinking that Julie Murray was trying to suppress some of the truth about her sister.
Yeah.
And what she said to me was that she doesn't care. She just wants the truth because it's the truth that's going to bring more home. And I find that the victims' families that I interview, you know, um, they'll often say that it's a therapeutic experience, that it's healing, that they're able to talk about things they wouldn't normally be able to talk about because of that compassion. And that brings us closer to the truth. And I think that's important. To answer your question, Yes, my background in journalism and understanding journalism ethics and understanding that your obligation as a journalist is to minimize harm, so you don't if you're at a question, it's really simple. Ask yourself what will do more harm for good, with the truth as your guiding principle. And then I think, being driven over by the national media and the international media, and being able to look at articles about yourself and being like, well, you didn't need to put that in to tell the truth, really does give me a good perspective.
Yeah. You've spoken before in interviews about, I think, a school friend of yours who was murdered. Is that kind of something that got you, I suppose, interested in true crime? And is that something you're okay to talk about?
Yeah, so that is a story that I would say got me interested in reporting in general and crime reporting in particular. What had happened was I had grown up in Maryland, Texas, Georgia, and our family had moved to Virginia during my freshman year of high school. Um, so during that year, which is sort of the ninth grade for here, we start in preschool and then it's first through nine. Um, and so in the ninth grade, there was this kid, his name was Winthrop Martin, and he was really, really kind to me. He was like a gregarious, outgoing guy, and he really introduced us to a bunch of people, some of which are still are me and my brother's friends today. And then during my junior year, during the winter holiday break, a story appeared in the Washington Post, a short story that he and his cousin had been murdered in a field not too far from us, shot in the back of the head. And that is not something, that happens in the leafy Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. It is not a common thing. And I was able to see the reporter from the Washington Post come in, and the rumors died when she printed the truth. Family members and his girlfriend and friends had the opportunity to sing their song for him in a very public way. So I saw a community that became uh, healed and informed. Um, you think about something as simple as a murder happens and people are very worried about their safety. They're worried whether it's somebody who's among us. Well, solid reporting really helped us understand what we should worry about and what we should not worry about, right?
Yeah.
Um, and gave this opportunity to heal. And I found that profound. I found that as profound as I found the ministry, or profound as I found medicine. And and I was just drawn to that amazing force.
Hmm. That's really interesting. So how old was it Winford or Winfred?
He would have been
Winford, it
about
must be.
16, 17. I think he was 17. I probably was trailing him by a year. I may have been 16 at the time.
Was the case kind of solved?
So, yes.
Okay.
And it was a wild case, and it made it to the Virginia Supreme Court. So a man was eventually arrested for it, and it turned out that his name is David Moore. He was also a high school student at another high school, heavily involved in drug dealing. It was not a drug deal gone wrong, but it was money that was owed. One of them, either Winford or his brother, owed some kind of money. Never really got the why, but I ended up covering his arrest, detention, because I was working for the high school newspaper. He was eventually tried and convicted, but there was an appellate issue over whether he could be interrogated by the police without his parents' consent, because he was a juvenile. Went all the way up to the Virginia Supreme Court. Conviction was overturned, and I think it ultimately ended up in a plea deal instead of retrying the case. But there was some interesting law around that too, and I think that became an impetus for me learning more about the law. So,
Yeah, because when we've spoken, you used the term law student recently, or student of the law. And I asked them, you didn't study law, but you studied the law.
yes, correct, right. I didn't go to law school, but I've definitely studied the nuances of the law, and I think I think in understanding, the ideals of our society and what we as America were founded on, one of the things about America is we've always been a work in progress. We were founded on certain ideals. And those ideals inherently were not going to be fulfilled in the different, like in the beginning. So, like, think of something as simple as not having a king or all men are created equal. Well, these are aspirational goals that America had. And we've worked our way toward them through things like law and the legal system and through advocacy and other things like that. So I think understanding where our ideals are and where the law is has really been an important thing. I know you and I have talked about things like wrongful convictions. Like, when someone is wrongfully incarcerated, we're not living up to our ideals. So how through the law can we work our way to become closer to that? So I've always felt that's been an important thing to be informed about, particularly in my space.
Yeah, definitely. So that, I suppose, kind of ties into something else that I wanted to ask about in terms of, I suppose, the interests of justice. And because, as you say, the aspirations for justice aren't being served if someone is wrongly convicted. I think another way, kind of very key way that you talked about a lot, that our aspirations, and I say "our" as a not as an American, but as a person, that our
Mhm.
aspirations aren't being met, is in terms of missing and murdered indigenous people, particularly women and girls.
Mhm. Yeah, so for me, just to give you a little bit of the
Mhm.
backstory for me, I think that there's a connection here. I think being Black in America, you begin to see a lot of parallels between different experiences. And I can go back to being very young, middle school, and seeing the way that women were treated compared to the way men were treated, and being like, there's just something wrong with this. Like, so as a young Black person, I know the history of the civil rights movement. I know the Jim Crow era in America where, my grandfather had to count, he had to look at a, the right to vote. Black Americans have gotten the right to vote, but he had to look at a jar of jelly beans and guess the right number to be able to cast his actual vote. And they just did it for Black people. Yeah. Yeah.
That's
So I know this, yeah, the era of lynching. And, fundamentally embedded in me, people should not be treated differently. So I remember, and as a kid, naturally, like I'm not a big injustice person. I gravitated toward women as my friends and being of support. I was heavily involved in the church. I went off to a Christian university, and when I was there, the treatment of lesbians, gays, bisexual people bothered me so much that it actually led to a schism between me and the church, which was my real community of belonging. As a young kid, I would travel, our family moved from place to place, but I always had my church. I always had my faith. I always had my views. And so it was the one consistent. So it led me to sort of break away from the thing that was most important to me. And I think my focus on indigenous people is a natural outgrowth of those two things that we were talking about, right? Our ideals have not been met with this community since the beginning, and it continues today, right? And, you know, I think that they're very similar parallels between sort of like the British experience and actually a lot of the same players, if you think about it. But that's a whole nother thing. I'm sure you don't want to necessarily do a history lesson, but a lot of the same players, a lot of the same themes. But one of those themes that's very different about the Native experience in America versus the Black experience, slavery is so fundamental and Jim Crow and things like that, so fundamental to the American experience, it is impossible to erase. It is a part of our history is burned in it. But the Native experience in the United States, it's always been about erasure, whether it's taking their lands and moving them out west, whether it was sending them off to boarding schools or trying to assimilate them into American culture, or is taking people from the reservations and relocating them to big cities. It's always been about erasure. And I think part of the reason why it's been so important to me to use a tool like journalism and a tool like interviews has been it does not allow that erasure to continue.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what really got me focused on it. So in the back of my mind for many years, wanting to do something for Indigenous people has been important. And actually, when I was a journalist for the National Association of, it was then called the National Association of Native American Journalists, I mentored Native journalists, like young college students who wanted to go in journalism, help them at their conference doing their newspaper. So in the back of my mind, this has always been something I wanted to focus on. And I was talking to a Native friend about the missing and murdered Indigenous crisis, and it was mainly out of a reaction that we had. I don't know if I've ever told the story, but I think a big event was we were on an online discussion group, and we were talking about some issue related to natives going missing and murdered. And these people jumped into the discussion talking about how we provide natives all this privilege and I think they were Canadian. And it was very derogatory, as if there was some kind of welfare state that existed for natives. And I think that really sparked me. I think we need to like educate people and tell these stories. And I found through the encouragement of this friend, found Monty Frank. And that was the first interview I did. He was an emergency responder in Minnesota, an Ojibwe man who had adopted a daughter, Nada Frank, and his daughter had gone missing at 16 and went missing several times. And just as she was getting her life back on track, she was murdered by her boyfriend. And his story and his ability to articulate the Native experience has been sort of like a framework for me for my now. I don't know. It's been more than a dozen guests in the last 2 years related to the topic. And it also probably informs, I get on with podcasters and I get on with advocates. It's inevitably something I'm going to bring up to them. So,
yeah, it's definitely something that we've kind of perceived in your coverage is a real focus on this issue. I guess a couple of things I wanted to...
Can I also jump in and say something about your word? It's one of the things I really appreciated about your podcast is, you guys started doing a segment for each episode. I don't know if it's for each episode, but it feels like it, on marginalized people. And I think if you look at the common thread between the cases that you do there, someone who's trans, somebody who's Native, and you're covering a lot of things that other people aren't covering, which I feel like is another gap that needs to be filled. And you're building awareness. You can see that same thread that bonds me to the issue in yours, because whether you're trans, whether you're Native, whether you're Black, in some cases, whether you're a woman, it's a very similar experience. You are not being valued in the same way that other people are being valued. It's not to say that in that hierarchy, there isn't, a hierarchy among the marginalized, but I think I really appreciate that part of your podcast. And you can also see it in other places. I've done a couple episodes where, like, Leila Santanella's case, and I'm not sure if you guys have covered it, but she's in a part of Appalachia in the United States is very poor. Yeah. You can be white and blonde and cute in the United States, but if the words drug addiction or poverty are part of your story, you're not going to get the treatment that a lot of white missing women get. So
yeah, thank you for that. That means a lot, and that is something that we've tried to do with missing and marginalized. And yeah, there's definitely you're right, there is a kind of hierarchy among who gets media attention, I suppose. And yeah, certainly people with drug addictions or mental health problems are kind of ignored, and they shouldn't be.
I have a theory about it.
Hit me.
I think it's two-pronged, but there are many different pieces of it. I think this is just a natural human tendency. There's a part of it, which is we see people who are like ourselves, uh, and we tend to gravitate to them. And that can be very good at times, and it can be very bad at times. I would say for marginalized people, we tend to see the people that we admire, who are often white, who are often male, and we'll gravitate toward them as well. But I think for the majority, often you forget that there are other people who are different. I think the second piece is, why do we not cover the missing trans woman or uh the or the native person who goes missing or the black kid on the street? Well, the things in society that we want to look away from, we don't want to look at our history when it comes to Black Americans. We don't want to look at our
Yeah.
history when it comes to natives. We definitely don't want to look at things that we don't understand, right? People don't like to be uncomfortable. And so I think that comes up in the trans space. So a fundamental piece of my belief is that most people who are truly negative and trying to do harm to these communities, that group is a lot smaller than the group that just doesn't understand or wants to look away. And my invitation to my listeners is, don't look away. Come with me. It might hurt a little bit, but you're going to get something good. And so are these people from the experience. So I think, yeah, I could have a tagline, don't look away, for my podcast, I think.
That would be a good tagline. And do you feel that kind of it's having an impact? Because what I've noticed on I've heard creators say they get fewer listens whenever they cover a case of a missing Indigenous person. And I've seen the comments, especially on Twitter, the health site. But kind of a lot of people just, when it's a native person, an Indigenous person, comments of hostility, like you say, kind of, we give them everything. And do you feel that kind of that's continuing? But do you feel there's things are starting to change?
Oh, yeah, of course. So here's the flip side, the upside. I get podcasters reaching out to me all the time who say, hey, I really want to do a missing and murdered Indigenous case. Do you have any ideas? Or do you know any advocates who might know information? And I've been able to build up a network of people, whether that's Gabby Petito's parents or Darlene Gomez, an attorney in New Mexico who focuses on it. So I can connect people. And it's been really rewarding in the background to be able to connect these TV producers and podcasters and different advocates to each other. Like, if you think about it, David Middleman and Kristen Middleman, who run Othram, which is the forensic lab that's been doing amazing things with DNA, they are passionate about these issues. So it gives me an opportunity to say, hey, David, here's this other person that you should connect with. So whether it's becoming public or it's happening silently in the background, do I think when I see all this amazing group of people around me that they have an opportunity to have an awesome impact? Yes, I do. I really do.
It's great. One of the cases that you've talked a lot about is that of Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, and you've interviewed her sister Kimberly. So how did you kind of get involved or hear about that case initially? And tell us some of the kind of the background of the case.
Yeah. So Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, 20-year-old woman who went missing on the Blackfeet Reservation, which is in northwestern Montana, out in the west. Beautiful, beautiful space on the front of the Rocky Mountains out there. She went missing in, let's see, it's somewhat debated, but we can say early June of 2017. Had a lot of promise. Her grandfather had recently died. She was an exceptional student. She was so smart that people from another community college, when she was in community college, the professors invited her over to talk about research that she had done. So, really promising person from this this community, and her grandfather had died. Her first real love and relationship had broken up, and she slipped into what I would say is an older crowd, and there were drugs involved in the overall group. She disappeared. Um, and Kimberly, her sister, had been in Morocco and was coming back from Morocco when she disappeared. And there were just a lot of strange things that happened afterwards. This man named Sam McDonald had this fanciful story of spending 6 days with Ashley at his lakefront cabin, which I had the opportunity to visit this a couple months ago. It was a very interesting experience. It's not the first time I've been kicked off somebody's property, and it will not be the last time. So, but yeah, so he had this fanciful story, and Kimberly was thinking, who can I call in my family who will know about this group and this scene? When she called her cousin, Tashina, who has the last name Eastwood, Crane, and Valenzuela. Um, and so Tashina acted really weird and was talking about how Kimberly should talk to her husband, Paul Valenzuela. That Paul, kind of intimating that Paul knew something or Paul did something. And it really unraveled because Sam, at the end of his story, said Paul was picking up Ashley. And she's never been seen since. There have been tons of searches. It's one of the few missing and murdered Indigenous cases that's gotten a decent amount of coverage. But Brett and Alice from the prosecutors, this is how I found out about it. They did an episode about it in 2023, and it just captured me. That this woman, in many ways, like our biggest cases of missing persons, you know, you compare Ashley to Natalie Holloway or to Gabby Petito, and she had all that promise and all that potential, and none of that coverage, in part because I think um, she was Indigenous, and that really inspired me to, I think it was the spark that led me to look for cases and become involved. And I've had Kimberly on. I've also had Haley Amiso, who is um, one of Ashley's friends and classmates from Grounding High School, who was also inspired by her disappearance to go into forensic anthropology and has created, for 2 years running, a forensic anthropology firm that is basically turning into a forensic investigation firm, a nonprofit. They're doing DNA work. But they focus on getting resources to reservations, getting resources to native cases. They partner with the University of Montana. They have lab space. I mean, they are doing amazing things. And I think, like there's an opportunity in every tragedy for beautiful things to come. And Ashley may never be found, but she is going to do more good than I think she ever could have imagined. One interesting thing about Ashley is soon before she disappeared, she had said to to her sister, that she had been reading about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And she said she wanted to do something for those people. Well, Ashley is doing something for those people. She might be one of them right now, but she is. And I hope, whether she's in heaven or returns to us somehow on earth, that she is able to look down and see that her legacy has resulted in so much good.
Mm. That's really touching. Yeah, Ashley is doing a lot of good. And I mean, we had the conversation a while ago about that Brett and Alice Brett and Alice coverage, and you wrote the article about how true crime can do so much good. And I think that's very true. I think you show that in your show.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I try my best. I don't know that I always succeed, but I think intentionally I've decided, I am there are a lot of popular cases. There are a lot of well-known cases. I could come up with a list of guests that would guarantee, downloads would go higher and higher and higher. But I would much rather reach a smaller group with an important case that they care about. Like one of the things that makes me happiest in my Facebook group or on my Patreon page is when someone says something along the lines of, I didn't really know about this, or, oh, this has made me really interested in it. You know, I think creating one additional advocate or one additional person who cares can have exponential impact. Like Haley is a great example of that. And several of my listeners, they will pop up talking now about indigenous cases I've never heard of. And I'm like, you guys go for it.
That's great. You mentioned being kicked off Sam's property recently. How much can you tell us about that and your time kind of recently in Montana?
He yelled. He talked to us for a little while, but but eventually he and another person who was there, without going into whoever was there, ended up getting into a pretty intense conflict about some of what this person perceived were the lies that he told. And he ended up, it was actually fascinating. I can tell you this part. So he's yelling and screaming for us to get off. He says he's going to call the police. He calls the Blackfeet law enforcement. They head out. And so we drive off of his property into a place where they can meet us. And we tell Blackfeet law enforcement, we're not going to leave until you guys get here and you clear us to go. And then, we're waiting for Blackfeet law enforcement. And then Sam hops in his car with some other person who I didn't know was on the property and a young girl that he said was his great niece. I don't know. And drives away before the police can get there. And it was a very telling moment for me that Sam did not want to sit and talk with us and the police. That lake is unbelievably beautiful that he lives on. Part of it is on the Blackfeet Reservation. Actually, all of it's on the Blackfeet Reservation, but it runs against one of the most beautiful parks in the United States, the Glacier National Park. And Ashley may have disappeared from there or the mountain above, Divide Mountain. One of the most tragic things about it is if you look at the group of people that Ashley was with right before, and you look at the group of people who initially searched for her, 9 are missing, murdered, or in jail. 9 of the people. Leo Wagner, a young kid, younger than Ashley, family friend, who searched for her along that lake, disappeared several years later on that actual lake. His blood was found in a cabin. No sighting of him. I went to a art museum exhibit in Missoula, Montana, and the walls were filled with paintings of missing and murdered indigenous people just from the community. There was one where 3 people in one family, one nuclear family, were missing, murdered. And I think, and that an Irish artist named Brian Maguire had come over to Ireland to paint those paintings. And I think that tells you how much of a draw, when you really get to understand what's happening in these communities, it will connect with your heart. It'll connect with your own family's history, your own experience. And yeah, it's just a powerful testament to, if you will allow yourself to be exposed to this, there's no way for it to not capture your heart. If it doesn't capture your heart, you should talk to a surgeon to find out if you have one.
I think, yeah, that's definitely kind of true. And I think it's also, it's not just a kind of an emotional connection. It seems like we're at a genuine crisis point in certain areas, perhaps particularly in Montana. I know you were down there as part of this search and looking for Ashley, but would you say that we are kind of reaching that crisis point, I guess, in terms of missing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you've got in communities, some communities, you have dwindling native populations in general for a variety of reasons, including some of the laws that we have in the United States about what defines you as native, which, by the way, I think is a part of the erasure too, but that's a whole nother thing. The lawyer in me is a part of. You have jurisdictional issues. You know, a simple thing is on a native reservation, if I had been on the Blackfeet Nation and I had, let's say, done a burglary, during my trip, I lost my mind and decided to rob someone. Blackfeet law enforcement could not arrest me because I am a non-native. So even though I'm committing a crime on their reservation, they would have to call the state police and have the state police come over and arrest me. Well, what does that do? It attracts non-natives to come on the reservation and commit crimes. Ultimately, on a reservation in the United States, if it's a certain kind of felony, a violent felony, the federal government has to step in. So that creates another layer of jurisdictional issues. They're under resources. They don't have the labs like the ones that Haley is trying to build. So they don't have the same resources. Now, what we know about violent crime, and you know this, I'm sure, is that about 80% of the violent crime in some studies is committed by 20% of the people. So when someone gets away with one violent crime, whether that's a domestic violence incident or it's a stabbing or beating or whatever it is, they're more likely, or they're going to go commit many more crimes. And so your epidemic in part exists because of a simple thing. You can't put people away for the little things they do in the beginning. They inevitably are going to go to do big things. So to me, it's an issue of safety and security. And when we do not resource in these areas, when we do not fix the jurisdictional issues, it's just another way of continuing the genocide, but this time through neglect. And neglect is a very subtle way, you know.
Mm.
A very overt way is to, send the military to take the reservations. But I think in America today, it's very, you know, just a similar Black experience. Lee Atwater, Republican politician, said, hey, we can't use the N word anymore. This was in the early 80s, but we can say school busing. And we can say all these other phrases, welfare queen, right? That those were really code word for all the really vile things that we said about Black people. Well, that still goes on. We 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 commit genocide, we commit discrimination simply by other means. And I think silence and ignoring is one of those means right now. And I feel like I have a responsibility to fight back.
Definitely. I think, yeah, I feel similarly kind of, and I hope that we can have that kind of impact. And you mentioned kind of law enforcement issues in terms of resourcing and jurisdictional issues. That's kind of a common theme across the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people. I know it's happened in Ashley's case, but what do you think can be done to address that in the short term?
Well, I think there's a broader problem in general, and you can see this in a lot of the big cases. You can see this in Maura Murray's case. You can see this in the one I mentioned before, Layla Santanello from Kingsport, Tennessee. Poor communities out. Well, you can see it in the Delphi murders of Abby Williams, 13-year-old Abby Williams, and 14-year-old Liberty Germain in Delphi, Indiana. Rural, poor law enforcement agencies are under-resourced. They don't have the tools. I think of something like Delphi, where two girls disappear on a bridge and they videotape the guy who
Yeah.
kidnapped them. In New York City, in Chicago, that would have been solved in like 4 days. And I mean, that's no criticism of law enforcement, but the New York Police Department has resources that the Delphi Police Department, and, I just recently read the advanced copy of Kevin Greenlee and Anya Kane's book on the Delphi murders, Shadow of the Bridge. And One thing I came away with is law enforcement did all the right things in the beginning of that investigation, which I was not sure of until I read the book. But what they didn't have were the resources that you would have had in major cities or cities that had lots of resources. So getting experience resources to poor communities, to indigenous communities is an important thing. Sharing ideas, partnerships between agencies. I think that that's really, really an important piece of it. When you look at the resourcing issue, you're trying to solve a broader social problem. I had a guest who's a judge, Judge Victorio Shaw. He grew up on the Hopi Reservation. Well, in part on the Hopi Reservation. He's Hopi in Northern California, and now he's a judge for another tribe in Central California. And he was comparing for me the native reservations. And I slip into using Indian because in the US we actually use the phrase Indian in the name of the reservation. Um, it's something we need to move on from. But you know, the reservations where gaming has been very successful, so gambling has been allowed, um, they have more resources. They still have problems. They're still significant. But if you disappear on a reservation that has been very, very successful financially around gaming, more resources are going to be thrown at your case. Um, if you are in a place like Gallup, New Mexico, where there is not a great relationship between local law enforcement and reservation law enforcement, you're talking the Blackfeet Reservation, 1.5 million acres, 17 officers, 24 hours a day. There's only one or two people in the entire uniform part of the department who are on at any given time, you know. And I think the Blackfeet are a great example. They chose to fight oil drilling in a sacred part of the reservation and next to the reservation. So next to the reservation, they'd given the federal government a bunch of land that was very sacred to their origin story. And there was going to be drilling in there, and the drilling companies tried to make deals for them to be able to get money and other things, and they said no. Well, I agree with their saying no, but it's also come with a cost because they don't have resources. So I say all this simply to say we need to address the broader societal issues for these communities that are poor, that are marginalized, and at the same time within communities that have resources. And I remember this when I was in New York, taking the example of the trans community. They set up a specialized unit, a community affairs unit. These guys didn't do any arrests. They didn't police behavior. They would just go down to places like the meatpacking district and Hell's Kitchen in New York, where the trans community was, and they would develop relationships with those people. The reason why they would develop relationships with those people is they wanted them to feel safe in reporting a crime if a crime ever happened to them, or if they ever became a witness of a crime. So in those jurisdictions, we need to do a much better job of developing trusting relationships between communities and law enforcement. You see it in Black communities too, when there is a police shooting of an unarmed Black man. Guess what happens? The rate of reports of crime, witnesses stepping forward, not to mention juries stop convicting. Um, so I think these are all broader societal issues we need to work on in addition to the reservation and indigenous specific issues. And I think, and this is the beauty of it, Jess, the lessons that we can learn from helping address the problems in indigenous communities can apply to so many other communities and so many other marginalized groups. It is an opportunity for a laboratory that can help all of us.
Yeah, that brings me on kind of very neatly to something else I wanted to ask about. And we've spoken off air about Jax Graton. And for listeners, Jax was a trans woman who went missing from Denver, Colorado in April. Her body was discovered in a lightway on alley, a gap between two buildings in June. And I think there are some devastating parallels with other cases that we've discussed, but it's interesting you raised the issue of building a relationship between law enforcement and communities. That has not happened here. We're the opposite end, I suppose. Do you feel that kind of, obviously building that relationship is important, but do you feel that LGBTQ victims and trans victims, perhaps specifically, are taken less seriously by a lot of law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, I can tell you from my personal experience of covering cases and even talking to detectives. And, this wasn't a trans victim. What was it? No, it was not a trans victim, but let's say another marginalized victim. And it was a woman who was the victim. They had a pretty good idea of who the suspect was. And I remember the detective saying to me, NHI. And I said, what does that mean? He said, no humans involved. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, it's kind of simple. I'm not going to get any help from our precinct on this. There's not going to be a call from the mayor to the police commissioner about this. The city councilmen are not going to be up in arms asking us to pursue that. So basically, the case will be treated like the suspect and the victim is not human. And you can see the line there. Well, what does that have to do with? It's simple. The community is not pressuring the mayor and the city council, so the mayor and the city council are not pressuring the police department. So they're not putting the resources there. And that would be one thing if the police department could just choose to put its resources wherever it wants. But the city council and the mayor are pressuring them to put resources into other places. So there was a decided change in New York when we elected our first LGBTQ council person who chaired a committee. She eventually became the head of the city council. And I don't think it just impacted LGBTQ plus victims. It impacted the way that a lot of victims were treated. So I think we as a society and communities have an opportunity to put pressure on law enforcement to really focus on developing these relationships, to treating everyone like they are equal, they're humans, they're precious lives that have either been taken or disappeared or had some other crime happen to them. And we've seen it work, right? We've seen it work with domestic violence, for example. We've seen it work in other areas. And Denver is an interesting example historically. There was a phase in the late 90s and the early 2000s where they were putting a great emphasis on developing strong relationships with the gay community there. And eventually those efforts, I think they sort of took it for granted and resources got pulled from those efforts. So there are two things that I think need to be done. Those efforts need to happen. And you see this happening in Alaska. I did an episode with a woman named Kendra Klosser, who's in Alaska. And she was successful in getting the Alaska police superintendent to become aware of the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. He devoted resources to it. But the worry becomes, once he's gone, is the next person going to do it? So what they did was they got it enshrined in law. So as a part of Alaska's law, there is a missing and murdered Indigenous unit. The amount of officers they have to have on it is fixed in law, and it is now fixed in law. You cannot become a police officer in Alaska without having intensive training created both by law enforcement and the Native community. It's like a week plus of training on dealing with, connecting with Indigenous communities. You cannot get the badge, and you can't keep the badge if you don't do additional training. So I think making these efforts is important, but enshrining them in law so the next guy can't put his focus back on just the majority.
Yeah, I think that's a really good approach. And so part of the issue that's emerged in in Lakewood in Denver is the terminology with which the terminology Jax has been referred to as a transgender or using her dead name. And that has really kind of undermined confidence in the investigation as a whole.
Yeah, so dead naming's an interesting piece,
Mm.
right? So I think, I am a firm believer that publications should lean on using the name that a person prefers, whether it's Jason with a Y or whether it's Jags. But that's actually a legitimate piece of it. When you're looking into someone's victimology and history, maybe the person is also known as something else, like, right? So we should have a societal sensitivity to using people's actual names, because I'm going to call it what it is, and it's their actual names. But there's nothing wrong with referencing also that this person may also be known to some people as fill in the blank. That can help with victimology. So I think both being, and you can see what I'm saying here, you can be sensitive and at the same time effective by really handling these things in thoughtful ways. Now, if Denver if in Colorado there is a press spokesperson or a detective who doesn't really understand these issues, they're inevitably going to fumble it, right? They're inevitably going to create issues. Same thing with the press. So I think being able to educate people on the most effective ways to do it, because if I had a friend who was trans who went missing, I would want to be able to collect the victimology on them by every name. If they went by, like, I don't know, Krusty the Clown, I would want you all to know all those things, but I would want to be able to do it in a way that is very sensitive and compassionate, but ultimately effective. And so I think that comes back to the thing about educating. I don't think most of these people are trying to do harm. I don't think they're using a disappearance or a murder as a platform for their prejudices, but their prejudices or lack of understanding may get in the way of doing what they really want to do, which is have a positive impact on this person's life or their case. And I think turning to the way that Alaska's handled it is a great guide to 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 many of these issues. I also think, when I look at Jax's case and I see your coverage, I think the advocacy that's building up is really, really important. A lot of people may negatively react to people advocating for accountability for the police department, like, a couple weeks into an investigation, and they might say, be patient. But I say, no, send the message that your feet are going to be held to the fire on this. Like, there will be accountability. There'll be somebody looking on the back end of this file. If you close it as a suicide or a drug overdose or whatever it is, then all your records are going to become available at that point, and there will be people looking. I don't think that's bad. It's a bad thing. I mean, that's what journalism does. It holds people accountable. When we cover a story, we'll be following it up. It does change the way you do your job. You cross your I's, dot your T's, or you dot your I's and cross your T's, whichever. But 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 truthfully, I think that accountability is really, really important.
I completely agree. The advocacy in Jax's case has been incredible. To give a couple of examples, at Lakewood City Council meetings, people have attended and spoken up for Jax. One of Jax's friends, Z, had Jax's ashes with them and put them on the table and said, "This is Jax now," to really kind of emphasize that. And also, Jax's mum, Sherry Lynn, we call her Mama C sometimes on the show because she's just incredible. Has just an incredible, amazing work around this. But looking at Ashley's case as well, it's Kimberly who has pushed that in many ways, a family member and friends. Well, I suppose, what does that tell you about advocacy more generally? Who's doing the work in these cases where it seems like law enforcement aren't?
Yeah, and an interesting thing, I think to some extent, and this has been one of my big revelations over the last few years in covering these cases that I didn't even pick up from being a crime reporter in Baltimore and New York. Um, Police do not know how to handle missing persons cases. Um, and, if you look at the police in New Hampshire when Moore Murray disappeared, or you look at Ashley's case, they really don't know what to do. That's because the vast majority of people who go missing for a day or two, and they don't know the signs. There's an amazing podcast that I tell every investigator I run into. I'm like, you have to listen to the Unfound podcast by Ed Densel. It's just about, and he's actually creating a database of factors to look for when you should really pay attention. But there is no expertise in law enforcement because it very rarely happens. You know, a shooting murder or domestic murder, those things happen. There's a playbook. There are clues to look for. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit has data that you can utilize statistically. This one doesn't look good. That does not exist for missing persons, just giving you that as an example. And I think that piece of it is a real sort of impediment. And because of that impediment, one of the things that I think families have to do is they basically have to take over the case very early on when it comes to missing persons cases. And I think that there's another element at play, right? And you use Jax as an example, that when someone's a part of a marginalized community and we only have one or two detectives assigned to it, you know, one of the things that happens is there are a lot of things that those officers can't do. So how do I develop a relationship with law enforcement and advocate and set up searches without annoying law enforcement are huge elements of what I think a lot of folks have to do in either missing cases because the police don't understand them, or marginalized cases because the resources are not going to be there. When Brian Thompson, United Healthcare executive, was shot in Midtown Manhattan in New York, there were hundreds of NYPD detectives on the case. Most police departments don't have hundreds of detectives, but like half the detectives in the city were on the case. When I covered a woman who was poor and homeless, whose body was found in Central Park, it got, so on the other side of the park of where Brian Thompson, it got 2 investigators for a couple weeks. So yeah, the families have to step up. Goes back to that point I'm making about allocating resources. If the police in Lakewood threw all their resources on this case, there would be less for the families to do. If they threw half their resources, if they doubled their resources, if they threw any resources, I don't think you would have to have families doing what they do. And your point about Ashley is very true. The big problem has been Blackfeet law enforcement has some responsibility for the case. The state of Montana has its fingers in a part of it. The Glacier County Sheriff has their fingers. The FBI owns the case. And it's a rural jurisdiction. The FBI agents who end up in a place like Montana are either there because they really want to be there in that area, or they're very early career. So they flip over. The number of people who have held the case. One thing I will say about it, I have faith in the FBI agents who are covering the case. Had the chance to hear some of their thoughts and their ideas and find out a little bit about what they're doing. And I have faith that not only do they care about the case, they recognize that these cases don't get the attention. So I don't think we can underestimate the importance of a case landing in the heart of a law enforcement officer. So I think also it's important to be able to tell the officer not just the facts that are important, or the detective, the facts are important, but to connect their hearts to these cases, to make them really important, like their daughter, like their son, like their friend. And I think that changes everything.
Yeah, that's really kind of, I haven't thought about it in terms of, I suppose, personnel or people as individual law enforcement officers caring. But you're right, it must make a massive difference. It must really change things.
Huge difference. We have a mutual friend, Julia Cowley, at the Consult podcast. You can see, the case of Phil DiMartino, a gay man who was murdered in his apartment in San Francisco. I think it was 2010. That case is in her heart. And that case is in her heart, and she's covered it, and she's pushed people on it, and she's talked to an assortment of people that you wouldn't imagine about it, and elevated the case and connected the family to people. And I've covered it because of her. Other people have covered it because of her. All those things have impact. And I remember we did a live about the case. And this was, I think this live was open to members of my Patreon. And then I gave the link to the family and I said, anybody you guys want can come on. And Phil's friends, dozens of them in the chat who love him, who care about him and have the opportunity to be informed more about the case, get an idea about what they can do to help. The humanizing of people, you cannot underestimate the importance of humanizing people. You mentioned the part about people who have drug addiction or who have mental health. People feel like they don't understand it. But when I tell you the story of the girl who had the mental health problems, who always dreamed of becoming a doctor, who used to swing in the swing and yell yippee. And, when I humanize someone for someone else, or their family members humanize them for someone else, it is harder, going back to the point we were talking about before, it is harder to look away.
That struck me recently in terms of, because one of the cases that has impacted both me and Eddie is a local one to me, is that of Rhiannon Coulson, a mom from Coventry who disappeared and was found to have been murdered. And for various reasons, she has been somewhat dehumanized in the coverage. And we've tried to reframe that as every time we talk about Rhiannon, we say Coventry mom Rhiannon Coulson. And I think and hope that is having an impact.
Well, so that's a really interesting point too. How we describe people. The headline that says drug addicted woman, disappeared from fill in the blank. Whatever piece you may use, be careful. Use the description that may be relevant. Humanize them, so people can connect to them. I think those are all a part of the journalistic mission. And I remember you pointing that out to me at some point, or pointing it out on your podcast, that people weren't describing her as who she is. We need to look at the whole person and not only, forget the part of Jayson that's just like, cares about people. Let's go to the practical part of me that just wants to get things done. Well, what do we know is most important to solving a crime? Well, we know that the crime scene is hugely important. Everybody knows that. What evidence is there? What, is there DNA? Who could have accessed it? What happened to the victim? Well, we know the next leg of the stool is the victimology. It is the background. It is not the New York Post headline fact about them. It is who they are as a whole person. And those two things, if you imagine it like a triangle, on one edge of the triangle is the crime scene. The other edge is the victimology. When you combine those two things, it narrows who the suspect could be. And that's how we solve crimes. When I know who the victim was, right? Were they high risk? Were they low risk? Who was in their life? What conflicts did they have? What their job was? When I know that and I know the crime scene, it narrows my window on who the suspect is. And so I think that humanizing and telling the full story of the person, right? Even the ugly things that people don't want to hear, is what leads us to justice.
I agree. I think there's something of kind of, a balancing to be done when one side of a person, Rianne's humanity, Rianne as a mother, or any victim as a whole person, isn't being told. My instinct and what I want to do is to rebalance that and to headline. The headline isn't what Rianne did; it's who she was. And I think
Right.
I feel that I do feel that you do similarly, Jason.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also a piece of it for me. You know, when I have a guest who comes on, let's say Gabby Petito's
Mm.
parents, Jim and Nicole Schmidt, I, you know, as much as it would get more attention and more downloads to rehash Gabby's case, I'd much rather talk to them about domestic violence in general. And domestic violence that impacted Gabby's life and what we can learn from it. You know, same thing when talking to Julie. I felt like that was a great lesson for creators. We could have talked about Moore's case all day. If you go listen to our episode, you're not going to learn much new about Moore Murray's case, but you're going to learn a lot more about how you can be a good human to a person who is struggling and how you can handle and manage your own grief and keep yourself healthy and safe. So, in a weird way, uh, I would say my podcast is adjacent to true crime, and the adjacent part is really about the impact to the humanity and the lessons that you can learn.
That's a very good description. Um, so you've worked kind of across many different types of cases, and we've talked about some of those kind of particularly missing and murdered Indigenous people. Do you think the same kind of failures have been repeated across a number of cases? And when I wrote that question, I was sort of thinking about law enforcement failures, but I guess it's also failures in coverage and failures in how other people have responded. Do you think that there's a growing public understanding that there are systemic and societal failures? Or is there to an extent people and us as a whole are still kidding ourselves that these things are isolated? Or, yeah, that's my rambling question.
Yeah, it's a really tough question as an American where we are right now with our country. I really believe that like progress happens in peaks and valleys. You go up, go down, and you hope the next mountain is taller than the previous mountain. So, you know, I think what you're getting at is, do we look at the big picture? Do we look at the sociological factors? Do we look at it from the perspective of social psychology instead of individual scenarios or situations? I would say over time we have gotten better at that. Like we've made people less of a character. But I really do think it goes in peaks and valleys. And I think when we focus on people holistically, we're better off. You know, some of my episodes don't focus on true crime. I've got one coming about the Mother God cult.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, the Amy Carlson who led it, you know, one of her close friends, lover who left the cult comes and talks, and we get a picture of her humanity that I just did not know existed from the HBO documentary. But there are huge, important lessons in that story about belonging and the danger of getting sucked into something like QAnon or into a cult. You know, I had a guest recently where we just talked about addiction, alcohol addiction, and how it derailed his life. And I think part of the reason why I focus on these things is that we do have to address these broader societal issues and these broader social issues. You know, you think of something as simple as cancer. Well, simple. It's hard to say. But there was a time in the United States, people would not talk about the fact that they had cancer because of the shame. And there weren't human stories out there because the way cancer was perceived was that you had done something wrong. So there weren't people walking and doing annual marches and raising money. There wasn't the same political pressure. And now that we've relieved the stigma of having cancer, we've made enormous progress. You know, I think something similar can happen with mental health as we're talking about it more. And I think something can happen with all of these issues. Again, I don't know why I'm going back to this theme, but if we just stop looking away.
On that kind of note, the cases that we've talked about, and more generally, kind of the cases that we hear about in true crime, the unsolved cases, case of marginalized people. What do you think that our responsibility is as a true crime community, as listeners, or as creators? What does solidarity and support look like for those of us who aren't involved but want to help?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is let's deal with listeners, viewers. Hey, a lot of you guys are here because you're advocates. A lot of you are here because you like mysteries. A lot of you are here because you like good analysis. Some care about the sociological issues. I think, and a lot of people are here truly for entertainment and being transported and because they find it interesting. You all have a role. Like there is an opportunity for for true crime to be a gateway drug to advocacy and a gateway drug to making a difference. Now, it doesn't mean that the same person who's here for entertainment is going to do it in the same way that the person who's here for advocacy is, but you can just look for opportunities to do good. Now, so that's one piece of it. You can also look for opportunities to make sure you're not doing harm, right? Am I giving clicks in my eyeballs to creators who are harming people? All you have to do is stop that, and that can have an enormous impact. If I hear about a podcast episode that's problematic, if I hear a documentary that's problematic, as much as as somebody who's journalistic, care about maybe seeing the other side and analyzing the other side, I'm not going to click. I'm not going to open. I'm not going to watch the documentary. I'm not going to listen to the episode. And because that is my vote. That is my opportunity to vote against harm. And so I think that's one thing that really runs through it. I think creators have an obligation to really grab some of those journalistic principles. Not every creator is a journalist, right? Some are they're analytical. They're telling a story and they're analyzing it. Some are advocates, right? The whole purpose of their podcast is advocates. And some are journalists, right? They're reporting on things, they're collecting things. But in each of those buckets, two things: truth and whatever will bring the least amount of harm are principles that should exist in both of those spaces. And so this is one way of saying, for creators and for listeners, truth and what will bring the least amount of harm are probably the most important things for the true crime community. And then, the third thing I'll add as my bonus: advocacy for your fellow humans.
Yeah.
Find a way to do something good. Yeah.
I think those are really good answers. Kind of voting with not voting with your feet, but voting with your eyes and your ears about what kind of content we're consuming. I think that's really important.
Yeah, huge.
So you've told and as you say, you're true crime adjacent, Jayson, true crime adjacent. But you've told me.
I have to give credit to Robert Palmer of the Broken System podcast, which is a true crime podcast.
Great.
He was giving the intro. I was at an event, a true crime event, and he was giving an intro to me, and he was like, "Jayson is true crime adjacent." And I was like, "You got it. We're gonna either call it true crime adjacent or true crime adjacent."
On your show, the Silver Linings Handbook, you've covered a number of cases, but also just other stories of kind of human grief, human resilience, and life. What do you think that's kind of, I suppose, taught you about people, about the world, and about yourself, about Jayson Blair?
Yeah, well, I mean, I find, and I think this is in part of the art of interviewing, I think, is keeping an open heart, right? You have a script in your head, but it's really the other person's story and not your own story. And if you take that approach, you and your listeners will often learn and find out profound things. And I think for me personally, being in the true crime space, it's really interesting timing because there is sort of like an analytical part of me. There's a caring about justice part of me that was really driven into it. But my mother died in the beginning of that first year of my podcast, and I'm glad she got the chance to listen to a lot of the episodes. And um, but she died during the beginning of that, and it created an enormous period of grief for me. And at the same time, I am telling other people stories of my grief. I am learning about my own grief and my own healing and the good that can come out of things. You know, my mom was a wonderful person. I would do anything to have her back, but like the experience of going through the loss of her has given me so much perspective and an ability to love people in a much more deeply way because what is the one thing that all humans share in common? And that's we suffer,
Yeah.
right? And and your suffering is an opportunity to love people more deeply. And I feel that about my guests, and I feel their suffering is an opportunity for them to love people more deeply. Um, and I think it's just really a matter of, are you going to take that opportunity? And I think one of the things that I've really learned about, I think myself through this experience is that, one of the things that my entire life has really taught me, if we go back to being Black and seeing the way that women were treated, um, you know, uh, LGBTQ issues in the church, doing enormously bad things and having to recover them, that compassion is my sword and it is my shield. And I bring it into every situation, whether it's a personal conflict or whether it's a war with the creator over their behavior or whether it's about a case. And I think compassion leads me to focus on understanding why people did what they did. You can villainize a bunch of cops for, let's say, their bad behavior, something wrong. But maybe the next question we should ask is like, well, how did you get to that place where this happened? Like, what experience was it? I remember very early in my career, this is before the whole like Confederate monuments in the United States was a thing. I had to do a story on Confederate monuments where we had the idea of doing it. And I called this guy up, Sons of Confederate Veterans and some Southern state. I can't remember what it was. And I got him on the phone and we were just talking. And I asked him about, well, what about like for the Black community and the way that they're reacting? Because he was talking about pride and history. And the guy started crying. And he was like, I don't know. I like really don't know. And he told me that the first time he grew up in a rural white community in the South, his first time he was exposed to Black people at all were the riots in the 1960s. That was the first time he ever saw a Black person. Well, like maybe his blind spot was created by that experience. And maybe as humans, if we have conversations, you know, I'm a person who opened him up to the idea that that may be driving some of his insensitivity on this issue. It would be easy to look at this guy from the outside as a demon, but have a conversation.
Yeah. I suppose it's very easy to respond. Like you said, it's very easy to respond to someone as this is a terrible person. But if you want to change things and move forward, you have to look at how they got there.
It's a very lazy way to look at people. It is a very lazy way to look at people. And hey, I'm okay with a lazy way to look at people if it doesn't have a negative impact. And I think that's what we're really getting at, Do better.
Do better. Well, this has been really great, Jayson. Is there anything you wanted to kind of add? Anything you've got coming up on your podcast you'd like to share with us?
Well, the one thing I would love to say in general, I am so glad that you and Ellie are out here doing what you're doing. I think, and it's not just the missing and marginalized cases. I think that they are hugely important, but I think, giving good journalistic reporting and getting to truths and really the level of research you do. I can tell you're not just throwing out everything that's reported there. You're really looking behind it. So as a journalist, I really appreciate that. And I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. A couple things I have upcoming. Kevin and Anya, who I mentioned before, coming on to talk to about Delphi. It's a very emotional episode. It is our coda. There's a lot of crying involved and a lot of silent gaps. It is an opportunity to honor Abby and Libby, and I feel like what I told them in the episode was I feel like this is an opportunity to let Abby and Libby finally walk off that bridge. Yeah, have some peace. So I've got that coming up. Morgan Dana Harrington's parents, Jill and Dan Harrington, are going to be on the podcast very soon. We were talking about all the good that Ashley did. Morgan Dana Harrington disappeared in 2019 from a Metallica concert in Virginia, and she wanted to be an educator, and hundreds and hundreds of African children have been educated, more than Morgan could have ever touched in her entire life, because of the donations and the efforts of the people who were touched by that case or became interested in that case. So they're coming on soon. I mentioned the cult one, that's coming on, but I also have just that there's an infinite number of interesting people in this planet of, what are we at, 8 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion right now, something in that neighborhood. And I feel really blessed to have the opportunity to talk to a lot of them. And then any message I think I have for people is just that reminder that, man, true crime does really have an opportunity to do so much good. There is so much evidence of its good. And for all the bad things one may say about it externally or internally, do not forget that it is powerful in the lives of the people who listen and view it, and it gives them powerful opportunities to do good. There's lots of evidence of that good. So when we're talking about issues around ethics or other things like that, we're trying to make it better. We're not saying that it is broken, because there is a lot of evidence of its good, but man, do we have an opportunity to even make that more powerful and to not do harm.
And to not look away.
Yep, to not look away.
Well, listeners, you can't see Jayson, but you can hear his voice, and I think you can hear how important this is to him. I can see Jayson, I can see how important this is to him, and I hear it in his podcast, Silver Linings Handbook. So check that out wherever you get your podcasts. And yeah, thank you very much, Jayson, for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
We'd both like to thank Jayson for joining us today for the interview. If you want to check out his podcast, it's the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you wanted to submit a case for us to look at or give us any feedback, you can email us versionofevents@gmail.com. You can check out our website, www.versionofevents.co.uk. And we're on all the social medias at Version of Events. So give us a follow, give us a like, and please do give us a 5-star rating and a follow wherever you get your podcasts. So, we'll see you again soon, guys. Bye.